Hi, this is Rob Hopkins here, and with a little subscriber-only bonus as my way of saying thank you so much for being a subscriber, being a patron of this Patreon channel and enabling me to do this work. So what I wanted to do here was to just share with you 10 books that have been particularly illuminating and brilliant companions for me during lockdown, in the hope that they might be something that will inspire you and that you might get some benefit out of spending some time with. So this is the first one. This is The Coming Age of Imagination by Phil Tier, and you will know Phil from the second podcast that we did, the second episode of From What If to What Next. He writes beautifully about how a universal basic income could unlock an explosion of imagination and creativity. It's a really lovely, quite short, little concise book, which I would really recommend. The second one is David Olusoga's book, Black and British, which is a really great overview of Black history in Britain. And if you're like me, who sort of thought, well, before the Windrush generation, there weren't very many Black people and there wasn't much of a Black kind of history in the UK before then, I was so wrong. And this is so fascinating, goes all the way back. The historical research is absolutely amazing. And it goes all the way back to the very first sort of Black people who arrived in Britain in various ways and what their experience was, and then runs that story forward to the future. So I was gripped by this, absolutely fascinating, heartrending, and incredibly well researched. Really recommended. This is Courting the Wild Twin by Martin Shaw, who, those of you who don't know Martin Shaw, Martin lives near me, lives on the moors, I think, Dartmoor, and is one of the greatest storytellers, myth storytellers around today. Absolutely extraordinary writer. His use of language is like no one else's, and I just absolutely love stuff that Martin does and love spending any time with Martin, listening to what Martin has to say. And particularly the first chapter, which is called The Condition of Wondering, is an absolutely beautiful thing on why we need imagination and storytelling at this particular moment in our evolution. So I would really recommend this. Quite a quick book. I wrote a little review of it where I said, it's almost the same size as your mobile phone. So slip this into the other pocket, and when you would reach for your smartphone, reach for this instead. It'll do you much more good. This is a book by Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum called A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. You might have noticed during coronavirus quite a lot of conspiracy theory stuff doing the rounds. And if you've ever wondered, where does all that stuff come from? And what's it all about? And what are the sort of politics and the thinking that underpin conspiracy theories? Where do they come from? How are they promoted and amplified? And how do we start to sort of address that stuff? This is brilliant. I got so much insight out of this as someone who's sort of been aware of and wary of conspiracy theorists for a long time. This was really very useful book. This is a book by Roman Krajnik, which has just come out, called The Good Ancestor, and I saw him give a talk at the Seed Festival last year, which about this book, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. It's a book all about how important it is to think long-term and to think over many generations into the future. What happens in a society, in a culture, where we lose the ability to be a good ancestor because we're just so focused on our immediate needs, and how different the world and how different society would be if we were able to become good ancestors and think in the long term. I really recommend this. This is just fabulous. A really great companion to From What If to What Next, actually, because it's about shifting our imagination to encourage a much wider kind of a time span. This is a book I think a lot of people are reading at the moment, Me and White Supremacy, by Layla F. Saad, which is a kind of a workbook for really coming to understand white privilege and the white kind of experience and our relation to people of colour. And it has a kind of quite a short sort of introduction about who she is and why we should do that. And then each little chapter is a day-by-day practice, runs over, I think, 28 days. And it gives, and it takes you on a whole kind of a journey of sitting with prejudice and privilege and white advantage, and it's really pretty tough going at places, and pretty illuminating and really skillfully written. And I think, like a lot of people who've been reading this book recently, I have a lot of gratitude to this book and to what I have gained from it. This is by Robert H. Lustig. It's called The Hacking of the American Brain. If you like that stuff that I wrote about in From What If to What Next, which was about anxiety and stress and how it shrinks the hippocampus, and how living in a world of overwhelm and anxiety undermines our imagination, this is a brilliant, fascinating building on all of that and adding to all of that. It's about how this says the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains, and it's kind of what it is. It's on the tin, really, but I just found it absolutely fascinating, and how we have an economy designed to create stress and anxiety and to put people into a state of overwhelm and exhaustion, and that's how you keep selling people stuff. Brilliant. This is Rutger Bregman's new book, Humankind, which I'm going to be writing a review of sometime over the next week or so, which is just genius. It is a book which takes on all of those myths that we are surrounded with, the kind of ones about, well, we're fundamentally all selfish, and human beings are fundamentally really bad and selfish and violent and divisive. And he picks through that and picks through the science that underpins all of that, and says, this is all rubbish. Actually, all of the classic studies, like the one with the guy who sits in one room and supposedly is giving electric shocks to an actor in the other room, which has been used, and stuff like the selfish gene and all that kind of stuff. He says all of that is fundamentally flawed, that actually basically most human beings are actually quite nice. The problem is the power structures that we create which incentivize us to not be really nice. And how different would the world be if we changed how those structures would be? This may actually turn out to be one of the most important books of the decade and really define what the next 10 years end up be like. So I would really, really urge you to read that. This is really nothing to do with any of that at all. This has the shiniest cover out of all of the books we've looked at here. This is John Savage's This Searing Light, the Sun and Everything Else, Joy Division and Oral History, just because I'm a massive Joy Division fan. And and I rinsed through this book in about a day, and it's just absolutely compelling. About the life story of one of the greatest groups of all time, told in the voices of themselves and people around them. If you like Joy Division, read that. This is Jonathan Porritt's new book, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency. If it's true that we have 10 years in which to fundamentally change how society works, Jonathan's book sets out to say, how might we actually do that? What might that actually look like? So like like other stuff Jonathan Porritt writes, it is bold and visionary and clear and realistic, and a real kick up the arse. So I would really, really recommend this. I think it's only just come out, but I'd really recommend that. It says on the back, while we are close to passing the point of no return, there are still compelling reasons to remain hopeful. All the solutions we need to address today's climate emergency already exist. What's lacking is political will, and the solution to that is also in our own hands. And the last one is this one. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the guy's name. I'll just show you there because I'd only get it wrong and offend any Russian-speaking viewers. This is Chernobyl, The History of a Tragedy, which is about the Chernobyl explosion, written like the most sort of page-turning novel. And as much as anything, it is a really fascinating look at what happens when men almost entirely are in a structure which doesn't allow them to lose face to the next person above them up the ladder. So everybody is telling everybody what they think the next person needs to hear, and at the same time sort of standing by while the worst nuclear power disaster in the world unfolds. It's absolutely fascinating, and a real salutary tale for our times, and about how we fundamentally really need to rethink how organisations work. So there you go. So there's 10 things I've been reading. I hope you like them. I hope they bring as much joy and delight and inspiration to you as they did to me. And if you have any suggestions of books that you think other subscribers to this podcast should read, then do please write them in the box below. And that's how we'll share our wonderful learnings and libraries and insights. And thank you so much. And I'll do this probably again in 6 months' time, because I tend to rinse through quite a lot of books. Great. Thank you. Hope you've enjoyed this and found it useful. All the best.